Hello and welcome to BIL 102 New Testament Survey. This is Dr. Bart Bruller. This lecture is entitled Jesus, the Suffering Son of God, and it covers the portrayal of Jesus in the Gospel of Mark. You might ask yourself, why begin with the Gospel of Mark? It's not the first Gospel in our New Testament, not the most common Gospel read in many of our churches today, so why start with this Gospel? Well, as you've read in your textbook perhaps already, Mark is most likely the earliest of all of our written Gospels. The most prominent theory on how we got Matthew, Mark, and Luke was that Mark was the original writer of the Gospel, and it became a source that both Matthew and Luke later used. Another reason to begin with Mark, especially in this course, is that it is the shortest of all the Gospels. It is a good almost 10 chapters shorter than either Matthew or Luke or John. And so it gives us a more concise portrayal of Jesus, a little bit easier to get our heads around as we begin the class together. Next, the Gospel of Mark is very direct, very action-packed. It's easy to read, and yet it's also very profound. So it has some very significant points to make about the person of Jesus, and it keeps your attention really well. Finally, I think that the Gospel of Mark presents a distinct challenge or correction to some popular conceptions about Jesus, and we'll encounter some of those along the way as we go through this lecture. You'll see portrayed up in the picture on the right there, Mark pictured writing. You'll see a stylus in his right hand, and seated on a lion, which is the animal often associated with the Gospel of Mark because it is so action-packed. Let's do a quick outline of the book of Mark so that you can have an idea of the contents of this book as we begin to discuss the portrayal of Jesus in it. Mark begins with a rather brief introduction, the beginning of the good news, in which he cites an Old Testament prophecy and covers just the very basics of the beginning of Jesus' ministry, his baptism, and his first preaching. That happens very quickly in the first 15 verses of the book. Then we have a rather long section which deals with Jesus' ministry in Galilee. This section is mostly comprised of exorcisms and healings, with a few pieces of teaching interspersed along the way. Section 2 is really a transitional section where Jesus moves from Galilee toward Jerusalem and the Passion, and this takes place in the latter part of chapter 8 all the way through the end of chapter 10. It's in this section where Peter confesses Jesus as the Messiah, and this section is comprised of more teaching, and it's framed on either end by stories about healing of blind people. Next, we move into the final part of Mark's Gospel, the Passion of Jesus, which runs from 11:1 to 16:8. You might notice when you get to the end of your reading of the Gospel of Mark in your Bibles that there's a very odd notation about the endings of Mark. We're not sure what has happened with the ending of Mark. There are two suggested endings, one shorter and one longer, which most scholars don't believe actually go back to Mark. We're not sure if Mark intended his gospel to end at 16:8 with no clear resurrection appearance of Jesus, or if we've lost the original ending of Mark. We're just not sure. We will notice that throughout Mark, however, that this is a gospel of action. And I'll tell you what Mark's favorite phrase is. You might have picked up on it already. It's just the phrase, "and immediately." When you read the string of stories in Mark's gospel, Jesus is constantly and immediately going on to the next thing. And immediately he healed this person. And immediately he taught this story. Mark has a string of these stories all put together that put his gospel in its place. And they're all connected by this "and immediately" phrase. Not always, but most often. Let's move on a little bit to talk about who Jesus is in Mark. We get a pretty good clue about this theme from Mark 1:1. Which says, "This is how the good news about Jesus Christ, the Son of God, started." We need to point out first that Christ is a traditional title identifying Jesus as the Jewish Messiah, but Mark does not develop it very much. He uses it of Jesus a few times in the Gospel, but not with any great significance. However, the title Son of God turns out to be very, very important in the course of Mark's Gospel. Let's take a few moments to see how. Let's explore Jesus as the Son of God. Jesus being the Son of God is emphasized in the introduction to Mark. We see this title used in verse 1 and in verse 11. We should point out at this point that it is God himself, the most trustworthy character of all, who declares this on two key occasions in the Gospel of Mark. The first one is at Jesus' baptism in 1:12. The second one being at Jesus' transfiguration in 9:6, where Peter, James, and John are on the mountain with Jesus when he is transfigured. God appears in a cloud and declares to them, "This is my Son, listen to him." It seems that Mark has used these two key announcements of Jesus as the Son of God by God himself at the beginning and then at the midpoint of the Gospel, both uttered by God, to stress that this is the core of Jesus' identity in the Gospel. You can't get any better witness than God himself, and he's the one who declares that Jesus is his Son. Next, and strangely enough, there's another set of characters who know that Jesus is the Son of God in Mark. It's the demons. If we read some of the early exorcism stories in Mark, say in chapter 1, verses 23 through 24, 3:11 through 12, and 5:7, we find that it's demons who announce that Jesus is the Son of God. Let me read you 3:11 through 12, just as an example. Jesus had healed many so that those with diseases were pushing forward to touch him. Whenever the evil spirits saw him, they fell down before him and cried out, "You are the Son of God." But Jesus gave them strict orders not to tell who he was. So we can see that these demons have unique spiritual insight into Jesus' identity. This is probably because Jesus has come to defeat the power of Satan in the Gospel of Mark. This is one of the major emphases in Mark's Gospel, that that Satan's kingdom has been conquered by the power of Jesus, precisely because of his identity as the Son of God. However, Jesus does not want the demons to tell anybody about his identity. There is one exception in 5:19, where Jesus heals the Gerasene demoniac. He goes away from the land of Palestine, and Jesus says he's free to announce his identity however he wants to. But that's the exception that proves the rule in this case. It seems that throughout the Gospel of Mark, no one can completely understand what it means for Jesus to be the Son of God. They have very serious misperceptions about what this means and what it is and what it would mean for Jesus to be the Son of God. Perhaps they have too exalted of an idea. A person who's the Son of God would come in power and glory, which was not what Jesus did exactly. So Mark has to work with this title over a long time to convince us of what it truly means for the person of Jesus. Then we come to the climactic confession. I want to point out that no human being identifies Jesus as the Son of God until the centurion at the end of Mark's Gospel watches Jesus die and then declares, "Truly this man was God's Son." Not even Peter, the famous apostle, in his confession of Jesus in chapter 8, announces Jesus as God's Son. He merely confesses Jesus as Messiah, which Jesus then quickly goes on to correct by saying that the Messiah will be handed over, betrayed, and killed, something that Peter does not take to very well. However, it's the centurion, the first witness of the death of Jesus, who announces that Jesus is God's Son in Mark's Gospel. This climactic confession of Jesus' identity in Mark occurs at Jesus' death. It cannot be known before that. Let's close with a summary of some of these points about Jesus being the Son of God. First, I want to point out that Mark begins and ends his book, very beginning in Mark 1:1, the very ending at the centurion's confession of Jesus, by marking that Jesus is the Son of God. We hear this also once at a key point in the middle of the book, at the Transfiguration. However, Jesus is misunderstood, rejected, tortured, and killed as God's Son. It seems that Mark's point here may be to take an overly exalted view of Jesus as God's Son, again, one who would come in power and glory, and correct it by the actual experience of Jesus. Many people don't understand who Jesus is in the course of Mark's Gospel. Even his disciples don't appear to understand who he is. It's not until Jesus dies that people begin to understand. It's at that point that the identity of Jesus becomes clear, first to the centurion, and then we believe later to his disciples as well. The point that Mark seems to be making from all of this is that we, as followers of Jesus, take on both his power and his way of suffering and death. If Mark's gospel is the gospel of action, and Jesus is full of powerful action, of casting out demons and healing people's bodies, surely we as disciples walk in his footsteps. We get that power as his followers to defeat the kingdom of Satan and the power of death. However, the pathway of Jesus is not only power and glory, but also suffering, rejection, and death. This is perhaps Mark's greatest point, and the contribution that I think is a corrective to some of our views of Jesus, which has him seen as too powerful, too exalted, always victorious, and not enough emphasis on the fact that his life was marked according to God's will by suffering and death. We as his followers can expect to inherit not only his power, but also his way of the cross. Thank you very much.